I want to introduce Professor Herb Eagle, Chair of the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures, who will moderate this session, questions and answers session. And we actually planned on more complicated thing. We hope that Professor Misha Krutikov, Professor of Judaic Studies and Slavic Literatures and Languages, will select and help us with the questions. But it looks like there is a kind of civil disobedience. Nobody sent the written questions, right? So. Расстрелять, yes. No, we will be more liberal.
I use Stalin's accent.
Yeah. So, Herb, please. So I turn the things over to Herb, and now, please feel free to ask questions, and I hope we will have a vivid discussion.
I hope.
They will have questions. I don't think so.
Thank you. Originally, I was going to be reading questions, but I guess I will be calling on people. But before I do that, it's been a very moving and wonderful couple of days for me, remembering that time. When Artis was founded, I was a graduate student in the Slavic department here, and remember the very earliest period in the very small townhouse on Glacier Way, was it, where
Water's Edge.
Yeah, where the actual typesetting was done right in the middle of Carl and Ellen Daya's apartment before the larger operation. A great deal has been said about how much Artis and Carl Ellen Daya meant to so many people. And this is, I think, what I'm going to read is really just a minor footnote about all of the people they helped and what they meant to the profession of the study of Russian literature for those of us who were graduate students at the time that they began this enterprise. So I want to start by reading an email that I got from Gerald Janicek. Those of you who are in the field of Slavic literature might know that he's the editor of Slavic East European Journal. I think he's been that for about a decade. And he's written a lot of very important books about Russian poetry. And he wrote, first, it starts with regrets for not being able to be here because of another commitment. But he says, I would like to send warm greetings to Ellen Daya and everyone else involved in the event. Artists and the Proffers played a very important role at the beginning of my scholarly career by their generous willingness to publish my translation of Biely's Kotik Letaev. The fact that it was published, flawed as it was, and subsequently reviewed favorably by Simon Karlinsky in the New York Times Book Review, solidified my reputation at the University of Kentucky and maybe even saved my job when it might have been on the chopping block in the academic reprioritizations and budget cuttings of the early 1970s. I have also continued to value and use the many other artist publications of historic importance in the development of Russian literature in the Soviet era. So thank you, artists, for being there when you were. So this is a kind of small corner of people that Carl and Ellen Daya helped, myself included, that a couple of the articles that I wrote as a graduate student, one on Mandelstam, which I think was in the very first issue of RLT, and another on Lermontov, certainly gave me confidence, that I could do this when I was still a graduate student, that I could possibly be successful at that. At that point you think, what? Something that I write will actually make it into print, be typeset, rectified on both sides? It's a big moment. And also, my first hand at translating prose fiction was a short story by Igor Yefimov that was published by Artis. And I think if one were to look in the pages of in the contents of RLT, you would see just how many of us in that generation of graduate students were launched in our careers by Carl and Ellen Daya and artists, by their generous publishing of our early work. That courage to do things that others wouldn't do, to sort of take a chance on these young scholars and translators. So, Carl, wherever you are, and Ellen Daya, thanks so much for that. So now I'll take questions from the floor.
If any. No question.
Questions or comments? Because, I'm sure there are more stories out there that people might want to tell. Yes?
I'd just like to add something to what you just said. I was talking with a friend this past weekend who also went through the grad.
Microphone? Maybe we need a...
Take a microphone. Here, Nancy.
No, just to add more to what Herb said about how much help Carl gave to graduate students in their careers. I was talking with a friend last weekend who got her PhD here at the University of Michigan, and one of her memories of Carl was the first day of his Gogol seminar. He said, anyone who wants to learn more about how to get a professional paper published, just come and talk to me. And that had stuck with her all these years because I think it was very unusual for a professor to offer to give that kind of help. But he was very interested in helping people navigate their way professionally through the academic system. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. Questions for the panelists? I know that 2.5, 3 hours have elapsed in some of the presentations, but if you can, now that you have everybody here.
Unforgettable presentations.
And
That's okay.
yeah, no, here's, as I'm looking at Alexia's call, here's something else that was important. I'm going to tell some stories now. No one else will.
And there is Mike.
Oh, there is a question.
There's Mike over there.
I'm Leonard Charla, and I'm an attorney and former faculty member here at the university. I have a question for Marianne Sporlick. Marianne, you said something fascinating about the changes in printing technology, and I don't think I've ever heard anyone comment before on the juxtaposition of those changes in printing technology and publishing modes and glasnost and what was happening to our notion of Russia in the late 80s and early 90s. I wonder if you could say something more about that.
Hello? I don't actually remember what I said, so. Okay, so, well, yes, the technology changed completely. I mean, there were no computers, there were no laser printers. What? Yes.
Flipping machines.
There were, yes. So we had something called a light table. And we had a roller with wax, and we had to type up corrections and roll the wax out and cut out the words and paste them in. And the composers that were used at the time, they were not like computers now. So you could do a page, but if you made a mistake on the page before, you had to do the page all over again. So the whole process of printing took a long time. We spent a lot of time, just typing and working on the light table, cutting out things, and yeah, so it was completely different. And I don't even remember when we got our first, well,
82.
Apple was 82, okay.
But
Yeah, go ahead.
I remember, Lenny, that at the very first days, Carl had the composer, and it was also color-coded.
That's what I was talking about.
Yeah, and he had to move for almost every single line. And so there wasn't fresh, just total printing. I mean, you had to go back and forth and back and forth.
Yeah, computers now have automatic justification, and that didn't
Right.
exist with the
No,
IBM
and the thing
composers.
is, for somebody like Carl, who typed 110 words a minute, it was frustrating, but he did it,
You can still see on some of the old artist books where the cutting, we weren't actually so good all the time, where the words are crooked and so forth and so on.
Part of its charm.
Yeah, part of the charm, yes.
Perhaps people who have questions should make their way to this central microphone.
Here's a good question.
Hi, I'm Christopher Proffer. I'm honored to be here, and I just want to say that everybody who got up and spoke earlier, everybody who worked at the house at Artist Publishing, to us as kids, was part of our family, and it was one big family. And I just wanted to say thank you.
Hi, my name's Jeff Weidlinger. I was just wondering, I was looking through the list of books, which is really quite an impressive list. I didn't quite realize how extensive it was. I'm a new faculty member here, so I knew of artists, but not all that much about it until recently. But I was struck in particular by the publications in the mid-70s of a few translations from the Hungarian poetry of Miklos Radnóti. And I'm just curious where that came in, and if there was ever a desire to expand beyond Russian literature into other types of Eastern European literature, and just why this, why Radnóti of all people?
We did expand, but anytime we went out of Russian literature, we did a Mexican poetry anthology. We did actually a very good new American poetry anthology where I think half the people went on to fame. We did Radnóti complete, and we did an East European anthology, a big, big one. The problem was it wouldn't get reviewed. As artists, we were Russian literature. When we went out of it, the New York Times didn't review us, Publishers Weekly didn't review us. I mean, certain readers got those books. But we did a lot of kind of strange one-offs just because we thought the things were good. Mm-hmm. But it didn't fit the profile, and the reviewers were silent.
Ellen Davis.
Chinese drinking songs, we did that too.
Just a quick follow-up. Was Emery George?
Yes, Emery George was key to those Eastern European and Radnóti.
I have a question. I would like to ask Elena, what was the most interesting publishing event in Artix?
Okay, to me, well, there were two. One is Mandelstam's Voronezh notebooks, Voronezhskie titradzi, had been published in a collected work by Gleb Struve, who, by the way, warned us not to go to Russia in '69 because of the invasion of Czechoslovakia. He met us in New York and said, don't go. Anyway, he had done a very good edition of Mandelstam in Emigration, and it included, but it had never been published as a separate book. So I said we should do this, and I did a cover, and we took it to Nadezhda Mandelstam, and she held in her hands for the first time in history the separate book publication of her husband's cycle, Voronezhskie titradzi. So that was one. The other one is a stranger story. I was a friend of Bulgakov's two widows, and I knew the great Bulgakov scholar and in general literature, Lakshin. And I was drinking with Lakshin and I think one of the Medvedev twins one time. They were giving me vodka for bronchitis, as I recall, and it did work. It did work. Anyway, and so we knew each other, but not well. And I'd had dinner with Lakshin and Bulgakov's widow. And he was very tricky. He was very careful because he was at the top of a literary establishment. But he was a very smart guy and a liberal. So years later, I'm publishing the Sobranie Sochinenia Bulgakova, which is the collected works of Bulgakov in Russian. I should not have had to do that. Bulgakov by that time was super popular. They'd done Master Margarita, they'd done a lot of things, but they hadn't done everything because some of it was politically just very slightly on the edge. So I'm bringing out these collected works out of water. I brought up Master Margarita first, then some other stuff. When Lakshin wrote an article in literary gazette, Literaturna Gazeta, and he said, how shameful that we are not doing the collected works of Bulgakov, because beyond the ocean, they are bringing it out now. That was «За океаном выходит собрание сочинений». I knew the minute I saw that we were not going to have to do the 10 volumes, which were going to cost an arm and a leg and not make that much, because I knew the Russians were going to end up doing it, and they did. So that was a case where artists directly influenced, I can't remember now, I want to say 83, but I really, actually it should be in there. The Sobranie Sachini is in that list. I don't remember. But anyway, that was a case where in a public newspaper, artists directly influenced the literary process of Soviet Russia, which was not an easy thing to do.
Hi, first of all, I just want to thank you, Ellen, Daya, and your entire family and the entire artist team for everything you guys have done. I'm a young graduate student here, and I know that my career here at University of Michigan wouldn't be the same without all of your hard work. So thank you personally for that. But secondly, my question is for you, Ellen, Daya, and you talked about this a little bit, but I wanted to know more specifically if there was one moment when you kind of realized fully the depth and the importance of what you were doing with artists. Was there something that kind of really struck you, and for the long-term effects that artists would have, and that 30 plus years later that we'd be sitting here today talking about it? And did that ever hit you, and if so, when?
It hit me very late, but I will tell you who knew, and that was Carl. Carl had a big vision. He had an instinctive feel for the Russian psyche. It could be very funny, like the bitchy woman on the train who won't let you have the ticket that you've bought and says there's no room for your children. And Carl just said, fine, they're going to sleep on the floor of the corridor. It was winter. She changed her mind. He had that instinctive feel. And he had an instinctive sense that we were filling in the lost library, because those little reprints in the beginning were actually much more important than the contemporary writers, the Akhmatova, Mandelstam, Tsvetaeva, etc., that were torn out of the libraries and that nobody could get anymore. He had a much bigger sense, but it was step by step. When I went to the book fair Marianne talked about in '77, and I saw our readers, it was so moving. It was sometimes it was peasant people who moved me greatly. I don't know why. They came in, they didn't care about Nabokov. They didn't read that kind of literature. You know what they were in our stand for? Yesenin in English. And why were they in there? They had never seen these photographs, and he was their poet. This was so moving to me. And I think that's when I understood that if the English book with photographs could do that to these people, what must be happening with the intelligentsia?
Thank you.
I don't want to get out and go to the microphone, but I'm one of the old crew from artists, and I think one thing that wasn't talked about is how much Carl and Ellen Daya did for our friends on a very practical level in the Soviet Union. All the trips we took there, all the gifts we brought, all the medicine they arranged to be delivered, all of those amazing things that made it possible for our friends to live day to day. And I don't think in this day and age we can understand that.
You can if you look at China. I look at China's process, and it's so familiar to me, everything about it. Everything about it.
You know, I'd go on these trips and I'd have 2 full suitcases, and I'd leave with virtually nothing. You know, if I lost a camera while I was there, friends could live for a year. You know, if I happened to misplace my tape recorder, that was enough for someone to travel to Poland to get medicine for their grandmother or mother or sister or brother. And aside from the literature, which was amazing, and they appreciated the very practical human things that took place were just as important.
Well, we were in service to this culture. You know, you look for work that has meaning, and we did know the meaning of our lives, which is a great gift. But we were in service to this culture, and that included all of that.
I was lucky because I managed, with Carl and Ellen Daya's help, to snag this job as a nanny at the American Embassy. So I at that time, pouch privileges, so I was able to send things back and forth, and I remember, in order for it not to look too suspicious, I would send things to my grandmother's house or my parents' house, and they would open these boxes, and there would be bizarre drawings. I don't remember who the artist is, but I remember I sent a box to my grandmother.
Yankelevsky, I remember, it's Yankelevsky.
Underwear on over her head.
I think it was Yankelevsky, yeah.
And my grandmother opened this book and saw this naked line drawing, a naked woman put her underwear over her head, and she thought, what is that?
But I can give you,
Well, I don't think we talked about how horrified all of our parents were, by the way.
Yes.
The only excuse that they could see for going into Russian literature and doing what we did and taking the risk, they thought we must be spies, because otherwise, why would you do this?
I went to Soviet in 1972, and so I would have been 20 years old when I went. And I was very brave. Oh, okay, I'll go. And off I went. And we were all there many times together. We did things that were amazing and impossible.
Mm-hmm.
That's one thing I still have never quite understood. We were able to do things that should have been impossible for...
Well, Carl had a lot of elan, and we were so high risk as people that I think the KGB followers couldn't believe we could possibly be doing what it was looking like we were doing, because he was just very relaxed about it. He was just dribbling that ball down the court, really.
And he had strategies, too. Like when we go in, we'd always put things in the outside pockets of our luggage so that they could be distracted by, let's say, a copy of Cosmo.
That's right. I forgot that.
Not open our bag, and he'd say, oh, would you like this? And they would very quickly put it under their coat and pass us through. So it was an amazing adventure.
All right, you got a question, John?
My name's John Byerly. I was the American ambassador in Russia 2008 to 2012, but more importantly, I was a fairly young grad student in Ann Arbor in 1975 and 76. And in fact, I'll just briefly start out by telling my story of the first time I met Carl and Elena Proffer. I arrived in Ann Arbor in the fall of 1975, following 4 years of love for Russian literature and knowledge of Russian language pounded into me by Christine Rydell at Grand Valley State College. So I now understand the spirit of Carl that imbued those 4 years. And in those days, in September, the university president, I think it was Robin Fleming maybe in those days, had a meeting at his house where you would meet a lot of people, and a woman, some of you here know, Margot Menini, said, come with me, I want you to meet Carl and Elena Proffer, 21-year-old kid from Muskegon, Michigan, but with a Grand Valley degree. And starting Slavic linguistics, I hoped maybe here at the University of Michigan. Margot introduced me to Carl and Elena, and there was kind of an awkward silence. I didn't know what to say, and Carl, very quiet, kind of looked at me, and Elena leaned over playfully and punched him in the ribs and said, "We sleep together."
Now, that was after a party. Weren't you a Marine or something at this point? Weren't you a Marine or something?
Pardon me?
Weren't you a Marine ever? No? I remember you were leaving a party.
No, but thanks for the compliment.
No, but you were leaving a party, and you were so stiff and proper and so West Michigan.
Well, yeah, definitely. Anyway, that was the kid from Muskegon came to the big city.
Yeah.
And I was living in the Russian House, which was the Oxford Co-op in those days, and for me, much like Rachel, was it Heatherway Court? Was kind of, Heatherway Lane was, Heatherway was kind of like the Emerald City. People like, that I admired, like Joe Denny and Rich Robin, would go off there and do mysterious things, and I hoped that I would maybe make it to the engine room someday too. But a lot of things intervened. I got hired away by the U.S. government. I worked on U.S. exhibits in the Soviet Union, met my wife Jocelyn, who did her Russian and Soviet literature at Harvard and Brown. We merged our two artist libraries together when we made our first trip to Moscow in 1983. And the Russians who would actually come and visit us in our apartments would look at the bookshelf and they would see 2 copies of Azhok or Pushkinsky Dom. And after the party was over, only 1 copy was left. And now that we've moved back to our house outside Washington, D.C., and done an inventory of our artist shelves, they're quite a bit lighter than they were when we started. Yeah, a lot of the RLTs. I think I had the first RLT. That's long gone. I have no idea where it went, but I'm very happy in a way that I don't have it anymore. Listen, I spent a long time, obviously, in diplomacy, the road not taken, so I kind of envy all of you who stayed in a field that I started out loving and still love, really. But along the way, I did try to, in my way, build the same better, constructive, more productive understanding between Russians and Americans that everybody here works on. And that's why I was really happy to read about the Karl Proffer initiative. I think if Karl were here, he would be getting a little impatient by now with all of the reminiscence, and he'd want to be focusing and talking about this. Because you need only read Vladimir Putin's op-ed in the New York Times or John McCain's op-ed in Pravda to see how large the gulf of misunderstanding still is. We have a lot more contact between these two countries now, but the understanding hasn't caught up with the contact. So I hope we can be successful in taking this off a piece of paper and making it a reality, and you can just count on me to do what I can to be an ambassador to that end, because we are a bit overdue to put a monument up to Karl. But the best monument to Karl, I think, is a continuation of what Karl and Ellen Daya started together, because the work's not finished. Thanks.
I'm not here to wrap up the session. I'm here to ask questions. And I had a number of opportunities to ask Ellen Daya about the issues that I'm interested in, and we never got to this point because we needed to discuss some other things. And now I use it as a kind of occasion to ask. I'm a specialist in the 19th century literature, and what always surprised and fascinated me in the work of artists, the selection of 19th century writers. Alexia PCMC, how many people in this room read PCMC? Okay, but most our graduate students who do a lot of work, who learn a lot in our programs, we do not require PCMC. So how does it happen that you translated and published PCMC? And it's not the end of my question. Another writer who I was really excited when I saw that you actually published Nadezhda Durova, the cavalry maid, the memoirs of a woman soldier of 1812. It's one of the texts that every educated Russian read in the 19th century and nobody reads now. So how did it occur to you to publish such texts, to translate them, to publish? Is it a chance, or was it a kind of policies that you
Well, it's
followed?
kind of both. You got to remember, we never went to somebody and said, do this. And we never said, we want to publish you to a Russian, for example. They came to us. Well, the American Slavists all had interests, and they had translations. And they would send us a letter. And, well, Mercereau did Durova. We knew him well. And, of course, for gender studies, that's an ideal book. It happens that people had a baby translation that they really loved and they had done for the drawer, never expecting it to be published, and they came to us and we said yes or we said no. And these things seemed important enough to us to publish.
My questions actually alludes to a larger thing, how much work you did for the Russian literature as a whole, not only modernism, which was discussed yesterday, not only the Silver Age, but the 19th century
we did
as
a lot,
well.
and we started with Slova Polku Igoreva, with Nabokov's translation, and Nabokov translated Hero of Our Time, and that was a big coup when we got those reprint rights. New York had allowed it to go out of print because they couldn't sell enough copies to get by, but their 4,000 or 5,000 was good for us. So we took it, and Nabokov was very happy about it. So we did a lot of filling in the blanks in 19th century. Carl was supremely educated in the 19th century. I was spotty. I was more 20th. But we would both read it, and if we thought it was good, we would do it. That's all.
Earlier centuries too, like Avakum was
What?
Avakum.
you published too.
Yeah, Avakum and the 18th century Van Vizen.
Yeah.
So, and my last question about scholarly works. You published Alexander Chudakov, his work on Chekhov. You published Grossman, Leonid Grossman's book on Dostoevsky and Balzac, and lots of other scholarly work. So how do you think, after all these years, how do you think the publication of scholarly work fit into what you were doing?
Well, you're putting me in a Procrustean bed situation because we didn't get up in the morning in 1971 and say, we're going to do this, this, and this. It was...
The morning ever.
Well, yes, I did. Yes, I did. Yes, I did. I did get up in the morning because I didn't go to sleep the night before.
I'd like to object to that because Ellen Daya got up, Carl didn't, and Ellen Daya got the kids off to school. And I remember
they got themselves
sleepwalking. Sleepwalking. Instead of you had your cereal, you're taking your books, and then she sleptwalked back to bed.
It depended, but now I'm forgetting what the question is of.
The scholarly work.
Oh, the scholarly works, it was the same principle. It was sort of like for example, Eichenbaum's book on Akhmatova. We did these three very famous, in Russian, critical studies of Akhmatova. Well, we were interested. We had authors we were interested in. And Akhmatova was one of them. Chekhov, of course, was one of them. And so if there was some pretty good book that we thought might give something to an American serious reader of Chekhov, like Chudakov, we would do it. But it's also the luck of the translation. Did somebody have a translation of this? Did they write us and say, would you like to do this? So it was a combination. The Russian reprints, that was us deciding, like I think Carl did the first Russian book on psychoanalytic theory. What was that? Yeryomin, Yermakov, I can't even remember. Yeah. Simply because he's going, this is what the Soviets will never do. That was one principle. But the scholarly things, it was not random, it was synchronicity. Somebody had to have a translation. It had to get to us. We had to know this author and think, well, everybody knows Pushkin and Gogol, but Pisamsky, they don't really know.
Could I add one thing, Ellen Daya? This bothered me yesterday that Ellen Daya wasn't there to make a similar statement. Artists, I say this as a reporter who covers institutions, Artists was a classic improvisational institution.
Yes.
All that discussion yesterday about the canon and how artists contributed to the canon, baloney. They didn't think like that. Yeah, they couldn't think like that. They were entrepreneurs, they were seat-of-the-pants operators, and all their big decisions, I sensed from afar, were a reflection of taste. And taste is never categorizable by theory. Okay, taste is an utterly personal phenomenon. It's just
and there were friendships. Like we wouldn't have done the
Kovalyev's
memoirs if he hadn't been our friend.
Sure.
And they were good memoirs, but they weren't that wasn't our kind of book.
Or Kaiser's Russia, for that matter.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
But also taste is what constitutes the canon ultimately. Can they change the canon?
Well, I will say Carl was extremely educated in the 19th century, and when he was feeling his way, it was an exceptionally prepared mind that was looking at these things and saying yes, no, yes, no. I had an emotional connection, big surprise, to the 20th century, and so I wanted more Platonov. I wanted, Sobel and so on, because I knew what those writers were for other people, and they filled in blanks. Filling in blanks was part of what we did. The Lost Library of Russia. Yeah, do you have a question?
Yes, my name is Elena Summers. I teach Russian literature at the Rochester Institute of Technology. I have a comment and a question, and that's for Daya. I wrote a little cheat sheet for myself so that I don't get nervous. Everything is live and all these microphones. But I just wanted to say these past 2 days have been very enlightening to me. I think the word enlightenment was used by many speakers. It was very enlightening, very educational, and actually very emotional, surprisingly, as a Russian. And to hear Daya say that you came to the Soviet Union and you got angry. And to know that you were angry and you decided to start this beautiful institution. And you were already working for me when I was 2, 3, 4 years old. You were helping bring the change to my country as I was growing up. And just to know that, I think it really struck me. And so I want to thank you for your anger. I think it's the best kind of anger that one can have. So that's my comment, my question. My question is, I think, part of this legacy and what I've been hearing, what I've been observing is that this partnership, it's this rare combination of intellectual and emotional partnership between you and your husband. And so you live together, you raise beautiful children together, and you work together. And I was wondering, was it always seamless?
Was it
always seamless? Were there ever any?
Oh, no, of course
any
not.
challenges whatsoever?
No.
It just
we would disagree on things, or he would want to do a book and I wouldn't want to, and then we would kind of argue it out. I mean, no. And people's tempers, when you're cutting out the corrections or you're dealing with computers for the first time, people's tempers would get pretty bad. Shit was by far not the worst thing he said. His father was from Oklahoma. He had some reservoir of genetic knowledge about cursing, and no, there were times where people were irritated and in bad moods, but I can say that it was an unusually happy marriage and an unusually happy partnership. Perfect, no. Disagreements, yes. Because he would say yes to everybody, and I wouldn't say yes to everybody. But part of why we did what we did and how, social skills are important in this. And you have to be emotionally open to enter another culture. I mean, we didn't think about this, but I look at it now. You have to be open. You must love the thing, or nothing's going to happen.
Thank you.
This is Professor Emerita Asya Umeski of the Slavic Department. Also a co-translator.
Well, I have taught at this university in the Slavic Department since 1953. And Carl was one of my students. Now, I don't recall exactly what classes, what courses he took. And I do know, of course, that when Brodsky was invited, and maybe before even Joseph came here, there was a translation of Brodsky's poem. And when I looked at it, I found a mistake. Very interesting. The word is lisički. Now, if you look up the dictionary, it means little foxes.
Chanterelles.
He did it correctly. But in that context, it meant mushrooms. Right. That's the name of certain mushrooms, and I know Russian mushrooms very well. So I corrected that. That's, I think, the only correction I ever made.
That was Brodsky's Gorbunov and Gorchakov that Carl did a translation of.
Yes, it was a translation of Brodsky's poem, yes. And as I said, I did work with artists. I remember coming in and seeing Marianne about different things. I'm not sure exactly what I did. Maybe Carl asked me to look at some translations.
You helped translate Poem Without a Hero with Carl.
I see.
And help with the commentary. This is Asi Humesky, was Carl's favorite beloved professor.
Okay.
So you did Poema без героя по-английски.
And as I say, I have very fond memories of Carl. I don't recall exactly, like I said, what he took, what courses, and whether his dissertation, whether I participated in that, I'm not sure. But like I said, he was a real friend, a real colleague, and I think that his legacy indeed deserves praise and honor. And this is great that it is being honored now. Thank you.
I'm very happy you spoke, Asya.
I don't know if, I think there have been many wonderful endnotes, possible endnotes to this afternoon, but I think Asya maybe is perhaps the person here, at least in academia, who knew Carl for the longest period of time. So maybe this might be a point at which we could end this session and continue more informally at the reception, unless, oh, I shouldn't have said that. There's more. Oh, questions. Oh, there. Yeah, there's some closing remarks. I think I will turn the microphone over to Professor Mayorova.
So my closing remarks are very short and very simple. I want to thank all the speakers for their engaging presentations today. I want to thank the audience for very interesting, very sometimes unexpected comments and very insightful comments. And I think we had a very productive, thought-provoking, and emotional day. And thank you very much to all of you for coming here, for presenting here, and for being part of this symposium. Thank you.